So, you ever hear a story so ridiculous that you actually have to double check if it's real? Yeah, that's exactly how I felt when I saw this headline about a so-called breakthrough in European high-speed rail technology.
I mean, at first it sounds great, right? The EU making a major leap forward, investing in the future and getting serious about transport innovation. But then I looked at the details and wow, let me tell you, this one really takes the cake.
All right, here's the deal. Back in September 2024, a Dutchman called Hart ran a test for a high-speed vacuum train. Fancy name, right? Sounds super futuristic, like something straight out of a ski-fi novel.
Oh, they went absolutely nuts over it, revolutionary, a new era in transportation. The future of high-speed rail. But let's break it down for a second. What did this groundbreaking test actually consist of? Well, their train ran a grand total of 90 meters at a blistering speed of, wait for it, 30 km/h. Yeah, 30. You heard that right. Not 300. Not 600. Just 30. That's about as fast as a slightly ambitious bicycle ride.
Don't get me wrong, I love innovation. I literally built my career on it, but let's be real here, 30 kilometers per hour in a vacuum tube. That's barely faster than walking speed. And yet, they're calling this a milestone.
What's next? Are we going to celebrate airplanes that can take off at 50 km/h? It's like watching someone install a hamster wheel in their backyard and declaring it the future of power generation. And the kicker? They say they hope to hit 100 km/h by the end of the year. The end goal? 700 km/h with passenger operations planned for 2030.
Okay, let's compare this to what's happening in China, because honestly, that's where things get really interesting. While Europe is busy hyping up a train that's struggling to break school zone speed limits,
China has quietly built the world's longest operational vacuum maglev test track, 2 kilometers long, independently developed, and actually designed to hit speeds of 1,000 km/h. And unlike the EU, they didn't make a huge deal about it. No media circus, no over-the-top press releases. They just built it and ran their first test earlier this year, hitting 623 km/h right out of the gate. That's already faster than any commercial high-speed train on the planet today. And their next step, expanding to a 60-kilometer track to run at full speed. Now that's what I call a milestone.
this whole thing got me thinking, how do we even get Europe, once a leader in high-speed rail, fall this far behind? I mean, back in the 60s, Japan's Shinkansen was revolutionary, but Europe wasn't far behind.
Back in the 60s, Japan's Shinkansen was revolutionary, but Europe wasn't far behind. They had some of the best engineers in the world, cutting-edge tech, and real ambition. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Let's rewind a bit. In the early 2000s, the EU had a big, bold plan, a 30,000-kilometer high-speed rail network across Europe by 2030. That's a huge project, right? But here's the reality check. As of 2021, they'd only built about 11,666 kilometers, barely a third of their goal. Meanwhile, China went from basically zero high-speed rail in 2003 to over 40,000 kilometers today. And it's not just about scale, it's about execution. While the EU has been stuck in budget debates, environmental protests, and regulatory nightmares, China just kept building. And they did it at a fraction of the cost. One of the biggest differences: China's ability to negotiate and adapt. Back in 2004, when they first started looking into high-speed rail, the technology was controlled by just 4 major players: Alstom France, Siemens, Germany, Bombardier, Canada, and Kawasaki, Japan. These companies had a tight grip on the market, and they weren't exactly eager to share their tech. But China played the long game. Instead of just buying trains, they struck a deal technology transfer in exchange for contracts. They brought in the best engineers, studied everything, and then, well, improved on it.
By 2007, China had its first high-speed rail line. By 2010, they had more high-speed rail than any other country in the world. And now they're not just leading the industry, they're exporting it.
Countries like Serbia, Hungary, and even parts of Europe are buying Chinese high-speed trains because, quite frankly, they're cheaper, faster to build, and work better. Meanwhile, what's happening in the EU? Let's look at one example, the Stuttgart 21 project in Germany. This high-speed rail line, meant to connect Stuttgart to Ulm, has been in the works since 1994. That's 30 years ago, and it's still not finished. What started as a euro 2.4 billion project has ballooned to over euro 12 billion, with constant delays and political infighting. They even had to pause construction at one point because of endangered lizards. Yes, lizards. They spent euro 15 million relocating lizards. Meanwhile, China built an entire 350 km/h rail line between Beijing and Shanghai in just 4 years. It's the same story all over Europe. France and Italy's Turin-Lyon high-speed rail project, proposed in 1991, delayed for decades, now scheduled for completion in 2032. That's over 40 years for a single rail line. The EU's own auditors even admitted that their original 30,000 km goal is basically impossible now. Political red tape, environmental protests, and fragmented national interests have turned what should be a grand vision into an expensive, drawn-out mess.
And it's not just the infrastructure, it's the companies behind it. Alstom, Siemens, Bombardier, they were once the kings of high-speed rail, but instead of pushing the boundaries, they got comfortable.
They stuck with what worked, focused on selling existing products instead of innovating. Then along came China's Kirk, a company that wasn't just copying but actually improving and optimizing rail technology. Now, Kirk controls about 80% of the global market. And what did Europe's rail giants do in response? Well, Alstom and Siemens tried to merge, hoping to create a European super company that could compete. But the EU blocked it, calling it a monopoly risk. So now, instead of one strong competitor to China, Europe has two weakened ones. So, here's the big question: can the EU catch up? Can they get their act together and start building again? Honestly, I don't know. The talent is there. The history of innovation is there. But the political and regulatory hurdles, those might be the real problem. It's not that they can't build great high-speed rail, it's that the system they've created makes it nearly impossible to do so efficiently. And that's the real takeaway here. It's not about China vs. Europe, it's about execution. It's about vision. It's about actually following through on big ideas instead of just talking about them. And if there's one thing I've learned in my career, it's that the world doesn't wait for you to figure things out. The future belongs to those who build it. So the question is, who's actually doing the building?
And so here we are at a turning point in global transportation. The EU, once a leader in high-speed rail, is stuck in political deadlock, environmental protests, and bureaucratic nightmares,
while China is pushing forward with the kind of speed and ambition that leaves everyone else in the dust. Seriously, how did it come to this? How did the pioneers of high-speed rail end up getting left behind while a country that barely had modern railways a few decades ago now dominates the field? Well, it's actually pretty simple. China didn't wait for permission. They didn't argue for decades about whether a project was feasible or politically convenient. They just did it. They took the best technologies, refined them, improved them, and built a system so massive, so efficient, that it became impossible to ignore. And now, they're setting the global standard. Meanwhile, Europe is still stuck deciding whether it should cut down a few trees or relocate some lizards before even starting construction on a single rail segment. So, what happens next? Does Europe finally wake up and realize that if they don't move fast, they'll be completely left behind? Or do they keep dragging their feet while China expands its high-speed network across Eurasia, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond? Honestly, at this rate, China might finish a high-speed rail connection from Beijing to London before the EU completes its Stuttgart 21 project. And that's not even a joke. That's just the reality of how these two systems operate. And let's not even get started on the US because, wow, that's a whole different level of dysfunction. High-speed rail in America? Good luck. The land of the free is still stuck with trains that move slower than cars on a highway.